They were the faces everyone recognized, but not for the reasons you think. What if some of old Hollywood's biggest stars weren't just famous for their talent, but for rumors no one dared confirm? Behind the charm, the suits, and the perfect screen image, there were whispers. Stories that never made headlines, but never disappeared either. And the deeper you go into these legends, the more one question starts to surface. How much of it was myth? And how much was real? Paul Newman. It never felt obvious. And that's exactly why people kept looking closer. Paul Newman didn't carry the chaos or scandal that surrounded many of his peers. In fact, his entire image was built on control, measured, quiet, almost restrained. But in old Hollywood, that kind of restraint often created a different kind of curiosity. Because when nothing is exaggerated, people start noticing what isn't being said. Co-stars often described Newman as someone who didn't need attention to dominate a room. There was no effort in it, no performance, just presence. And that subtle confidence slowly built a reputation that never needed headlines to survive. There were no outrageous claims attached to him, but there were always assumptions. And those assumptions came from observation. The way he interacted, the way he carried silence, the way people responded to him without explanation. Over time, that quiet consistency became something more powerful than scandal, because mystery holds attention longer than confirmation. Newman never leaned into rumors. He never corrected them either. And that balance between visibility and restraint created a reputation that felt natural, not constructed, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Frank Sinatra. He didn't walk into rooms. He controlled them. Frank Sinatra's influence wasn't built on performance alone. It was built on presence. A kind of authority that didn't need to be explained because it was instantly felt. And over time, that presence started to create stories. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just consistent. People noticed how conversation shifted when he entered, how attention moved toward him without effort. And that reaction built a reputation that went beyond talent. Because control invites curiosity. There were always quiet discussions around Sinatra, about his confidence, his relationships, and the way he carried himself in private settings. Nothing was ever confirmed directly, but nothing ever faded either. That's what made it stronger. Yeah, because when something isn't clearly defined, people continue to analyze it. His image wasn't chaotic like others. It was precise, deliberate, almost calculated in how it presented itself. And that created a different kind of intrigue. Because instead of reacting to scandal, people reacted to presence. And over time, Sinatra became more than a performer. He became someone whose reputation was built not on what was said, but on how people responded to him without explanation. Jack Nicholson. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like reality leaking through. Jack Nicholson never created a separation between who he was on screen and who he was off it. The same intensity, the same unpredictability, the same raw energy. It followed him everywhere. And that made people pay attention differently, not casually, carefully. Because there was always a sense that what you were seeing wasn't controlled. It wasn't shaped for public image. It was just him. That authenticity became the foundation of his reputation. Not built through mystery, not built through silence, but through visibility. People talked about Nicholson openly. His lifestyle, his confidence, his interactions. It all contributed to a narrative that didn't need exaggeration to grow. Because it already felt extreme enough. And what made it more compelling was that he never pushed back against it. He didn't adjust his image. He didn't correct assumptions. He let perception define him. And over time, perception became identity. Because when someone lives without filtering how they're seen, people stop questioning the story. They accept it. And Nicholson became exactly that. Not just a character on screen, but a presence that felt too real to separate from the myth. Sean Connery. He didn't raise his voice, but he never needed to. Sean Connery's presence was built on control. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that quietly takes it. Every movement felt deliberate, every word measured, every pause intentional. And that created a different kind of curiosity. Because nothing about him felt accidental. From the moment he appeared on screen, there was an authority that didn't need explanation. And that same authority carried into his off-screen reputation, subtle, controlled, but constantly noticed. People didn't tell wild stories about Connery. They made observations, small, specific details, the way he stood, the way conversation shifted around him, the way people reacted without knowing why. And over time, those observations formed a quiet narrative, one that didn't rely on exaggeration. Because restraint creates focus. When someone reveals very little, every detail becomes more significant. Every movement holds weight. Every silence invites interpretation. And Connery understood that, even if he never said it. He didn't build intrigue through scandal. He built it through absence. And that absence made people look closer. Because when something isn't explained, it becomes more compelling. And Connery's reputation wasn't something he announced. It was something people constructed on their own. Elvis Presley. The reaction came first. The explanation never fully followed. Elvis Presley didn't just arrive in Hollywood. He disrupted it. His presence was immediate, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. But beyond the performances and the fame, there was something else people kept noticing, something harder to define. From the beginning, his energy triggered reactions that felt instinctive. Fans responded intensely, almost without thinking. Co-stars observed quietly, trying to understand it. And insiders began to talk, not loudly but consistently. There was a confidence about him, a natural presence that didn't feel practiced or constructed. It wasn't something he explained or promoted. It simply existed, and that made it more powerful. Because when something feels natural, people trust it more. Over time, those reactions turned into stories. Stories turned into assumptions. And those assumptions slowly became part of his identity. But what made Elvis different was how he handled it. He didn't try to control the narrative. He didn't shape how people saw him. He allowed it to grow on its own. He didn't confirm rumors, and he didn't deny them either. And that silence made everything feel more real. Because when someone doesn't defend their image, people assume it doesn't need defending, and that assumption builds belief. Elvis became more than a performer. He became a reaction, something people felt before they understood. And once that kind of image forms, it doesn't fade. It evolves, expands, and eventually becomes something else entirely. A legend that no longer needs explanation. Burt Reynolds. He didn't avoid the rumors. He made them part of the performance. Burt Reynolds understood something most actors didn't. That mystery creates curiosity, but confidence turns that curiosity into belief. And instead of stepping away from speculation, he leaned just close enough to keep it alive. Not confirming, not denying, just encouraging. His public image was playful, almost self-aware. But behind that humor was a very calculated understanding of how he was being perceived. He knew what people were saying, and instead of shutting it down, he allowed it to grow. That's what made his reputation expand faster. Because it felt intentional. Interviews, appearances, even the way he presented himself, it all suggested someone completely comfortable with the narrative surrounding him. And that comfort changed how people interpreted everything. Because confidence validates assumption. If someone isn't defensive, people assume there's nothing to defend. And Reynolds used that to his advantage. Over time, the line between personality and myth disappeared. What started as whispers turned into expectation. And expectation turned into identity. Not forced, not accidental, but carefully managed. And that's what made it different from others. Because Reynolds didn't just exist inside the rumor. He controlled how close people could get to it. And sometimes, that control is what makes a story feel real. Warren Beatty. The numbers sounded impossible. And that's exactly why people believed them. Warren Beatty's reputation didn't grow slowly. It expanded rapidly, consistently, almost beyond logic, moving through Hollywood in a way that felt impossible to contain. And that created a different kind of intrigue. Because when something sounds exaggerated, people don't ignore it. They investigate it. Beatty became associated with an extraordinary number of relationships, names, timelines. Overlapping stories all blurred into something that felt larger than reality itself. But no matter how extreme the claims became, they never fully disappeared. Instead, they adapted, shifting shape over time, because no one could clearly define where truth ended and exaggeration began. And that uncertainty kept the narrative alive. What made it even more compelling was his reaction. He didn't chase attention. He didn't correct assumptions. He remained calm, controlled, unbothered, as if none of it required explanation. And that silence did something powerful. It allowed people to build the story themselves, to connect the fragments, to draw conclusions without being guided. And when audiences create the narrative, they trust it more. Over time, Beatty stopped being just an actor. He became something less definable, a myth built on speculation, a reputation sustained not by confirmation, but by the sheer weight of repetition. Because when a story is told often enough, it begins to feel real. And sometimes, the more unbelievable a story sounds, the harder it becomes to dismiss. Clark Gable. He didn't try to become the standard. He simply was it. Clark Gable's presence didn't feel constructed. It didn't feel like something designed for the screen. It felt natural, almost effortless. And that's exactly what made people pay closer attention. Because when something looks too natural, people assume there's more behind it. Gable didn't rely on dramatic gestures or exaggerated charisma. His authority came from stillness, from the way he carried silence without losing attention, from the way others adjusted around him without being asked. And that created something powerful, a perception, not built on headlines, not built on controversy, but built on consistency. People around him didn't tell shocking stories. They made quiet observations, the kind that sounded simple, but stayed in your mind longer than anything dramatic ever could. Over time, those observations turned into assumptions, and those assumptions became reputation. Because when enough people notice the same thing, it stops feeling like coincidence. Gable became the reference point, the example others were measured against. And once that kind of image is established, it doesn't need reinforcement. It sustains itself. Because people don't question what feels natural. They accept it. And in Gable's case, that acceptance turned into something larger than fame, a presence that defined an era, without ever needing to explain itself. Marlon Brando. It wasn't just presence. It was pressure. Marlon Brando didn't enter scenes. He shifted them. The energy changed the moment he appeared. Conversations felt different. Silence felt heavier. And people didn't just watch him. They reacted to him. Because there was always something unpredictable beneath the surface. Not controlled, not polished, not designed. Just real. And that authenticity made people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't explain. Because it didn't feel like acting. It felt like something closer to exposure. That's where the speculation began. Not from exaggeration, but from intensity. Co-stars often described an energy that felt overwhelming at times. Not aggressive, not forced, just deeply present. As if he was fully aware of himself, and didn't feel the need to adjust for anyone else. And that created a different kind of curiosity. Because when someone doesn't manage how they're perceived, people start trying to define it themselves. Brando didn't correct assumptions. He didn't clarify anything. He allowed interpretation to exist without interference. And that's what made his reputation expand. Because uncertainty invites imagination. People filled in the gaps, built their own conclusions. And over time, those conclusions became part of his identity. Not fully accurate, not fully false, just persistent. Brando became more than an actor. He became an experience, something people felt before they understood. And once that kind of presence is attached to a name, it doesn't fade. It evolves. Errol Flynn. Yeah, before the myths, there was the man who made them believable. Errol Flynn didn't follow the Hollywood lifestyle. He defined it. Adventure, excess, constant motion. His life felt less like a career and more like something unfolding in real time. And people noticed that immediately. Not gradually, not over years, almost instantly, because nothing about him felt restrained. His confidence wasn't subtle. It wasn't carefully measured or shaped for approval. It was visible, unfiltered in a way that most stars of that era deliberately avoided. And that openness created something unusual. It gave people material. Stories began to form early. Some exaggerated, some denied, some never fully explained. But all of them pointed toward the same idea, that Flynn wasn't separating his on-screen image from his real life. He wasn't switching roles when the camera stopped. He was living it. And that blurred line made everything more believable. Because when someone doesn't hide their behavior, people assume the stories must be true. Flynn didn't correct the narrative. He didn't try to reshape it or protect it. He allowed it to grow, naturally, without interference. And that growth turned into something larger than fact. Because repetition creates belief. The more people heard the same kind of story, the less they questioned it. And once doubt disappears, myth takes over. Over time, the man and the myth became inseparable. Not because everything was proven, but because everything felt consistent. And that consistency made Flynn something different from everyone who came after him. Not just a star, not just a personality, but the original blueprint. The moment Hollywood stopped being just performance and started becoming legend. What started as whispers turned into legends, no one could fully explain. And maybe that's the real story, how perception becomes reality over time. If this made you see old Hollywood differently, don't stop here. Like, share, and subscribe. Because some of the most fascinating stories are still hidden, waiting to be uncovered in the next video.